Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Real Economy, Inflation, Supply Chain, and Your Business. I'm Darby Dunn, and we are live at the Chamber of Commerce in Washington, D.C., and I'm pleased to be joined by our guests. We have John Drake of the Chamber of Commerce sitting in for Neil Bradley, and Joe Brusuelas, RSM's Chief Economist. Thanks for being here. So much to talk about today. I want to start though with a little bit of a flashback. Our last webcast we did that was before the invasion of Ukraine. Since then, inflation has continued to soar. And I wanted to get Joe, begin by kind of your overall take on where we are with the economy right now.
All right. So I think the really important thing to remember is that price stability is a precondition of maximum sustainable employment, growth above the long-term trend of 1.8%, and financial conditions that don't threaten to upend the economy. And this is where we're going. That's the official policy out of Washington in general, and the Federal Reserve in particular. So we're going to see an economy that's going to continue to decelerate back towards trend growth later this year on the back of a very aggressive set of rate hikes by the Federal Reserve and the drawing down of its balance sheet. It's going to take the policy rate essentially to 3% by the end of the year. I think that's restrictive terrain. And this is in order to bring down inflation and hedge against some of the uncertainties around A, the direction and the price of oil and energy linked to what's going on in Europe and Ukraine and Russia. And then second, the ongoing supply chain issues out of China. The Chinese did not adopt an mRNA technology regime or vaccine regime, and we're all going to pay the price for it now. So we're in a period of uncertainty over the direction of pricing. Well, I think it's falling. I just don't think we're going to get back to where we think price stability is at around 2%, probably for another good 2 to 3 years.
Okay, so inflation's going to be a bit sticky for a while. It's at about 8% now, a 4-decade high. Everyone sees it when they go to fill up their gas tank or when you're at the grocery store. And Joe, I know that we've talked about how a lot of this inflation is driven by supply chain problems, and that's your area of expertise. In fact, you are the head of the Chamber's Transportation, Infrastructure, and Supply Chain Policy. Mm-hmm. So paint a picture for us now. We all remember that visual of the big container ships sitting in the ocean outside of Los Angeles, unable to get into the port. How severe are the supply chain problems right now?
So I think the visuals that a lot of Americans saw last year may not be present today, but I think a lot of those challenges persist. And I think they are potentially elsewhere, but they are present today. That long line of ships that I think Americans became very accustomed to last year, sitting off the coast of Los Angeles, they may not be in Los Angeles, but right now they're sitting off the coast of China. And that's because of the zero COVID policy the Chinese government has adopted. So a lot of the factories that are responsible for producing the goods that Americans rely on, those factories are closed down. And until those factories come back online, you're going to have those ships waiting to load those products up and bring it back here to the United States. There are other challenges as well that I think the supply chains are contending with. We continue to have a number of we don't have enough truck drivers to move the goods that are coming in. We have the upcoming negotiation with the ILWU and the West Coast ports that I also to contend with. Mm-hmm. All of these are examples of other additional headwinds that I think the business community is facing within supply chains.
Joe, the media, let's say, focus a lot on inflation being driven by consumer demand, and consumer demand has been strong. But you have talked about how the supply chain is a large driver of inflation. Explain what you mean by that.
Okay, so in our second quarter middle market survey, we had a set of special questions for the respondents. And what they indicated is like, look, the real problem is the global supply chain, particularly the one in China, and the difficulty in finding workaround or substitutes. While we do see some, I'm not going to call it reshoring, it's moving it back to the Western hemisphere, but it's really causing problems down market. Those firms, say small businesses, and then say firms that have between 10 million and 50 million in revenues, they're having a very hard time adjusting, finding substitutes that work within the cost constraints that they face. But therefore, that's what's really driving inflation right now.
Mhm.
It's what's causing firms to set prices higher. While it's certain that there is, too much money chasing too few goods, that classic definition of inflation, the kind of inflation that we're facing is far more complex and doesn't quite look like what we saw between 1965 and 1985, save the Putin price shock that we've seen recently around the price of oil and gasoline. My concern is that this disruption of these supply chains is going to persist, that we're not going to snap back to the status quo ante prior to the pandemic, and that we're going to be in a situation due to geopolitical tensions and just due to the sort of what you want to call the post-pandemic global economy that's going to continue to put strains on smaller and medium-sized firms. Therefore, we should expect prices to remain firm. And getting back to 2% on that inflation target, for example, that might turn into more of a 3% target. And we'll see how the central bank and policymakers move as we adjust to this new normal.
So if I understand correctly, you did the middle market business
Yeah.
index survey. It's about 700 business executives
Yeah.
that you surveyed, and they really emphasized the fact that just the supply chain problems were the main drivers.
Yeah.
So with that said, John, what is the chamber doing to help businesses who are in that situation, whether it's through legislation with the CHIPS Act, things like that? Paint us a little bit of a picture of what you're doing.
Absolutely. So first of all, I think I have to agree with a lot of the concerns that Joe raised out. I think that there is no return to normal, right? Pre-pandemic, what the supply chain looked like. And I think, a lot of businesses are in this space of uncertainty about what their future supply chains are going to look like in the next year, 2 years down the road. So what the chamber is looking to do is try to provide that certainty in as many ways as possible. One of the biggest challenges with supply chains is because the supply chains are so diffuse. There's so many players who occupy the space, and no one player is able to exert an enormous amount of sort of market pressure, market dominance on any one aspect. It makes it difficult to get your arms around it, right? So there are ports, there are ocean carriers, there's trucks, there's trains, and all these players have their own role to play, but there isn't, for example, the port can't dictate to the railroad how they're going to run their operations.
Mm-hmm.
Where the chamber's at, I think we're looking to take a few different tacks to help provide more certainty to the business community. On the workforce side, we have to get our arms around the immigration situation. We're going to continue advocating for immigration reform. Immigration traditionally has been a important pipeline to provide new workers into the workforce. I think that's one of the biggest drivers that we're hearing from the business community that they're challenging right now. They simply do not have the workforce to meet the current demand. Two, we're watching the ports really, really closely. If you look at so right now, beginning actually last week, the ILWU, the International Longshoremen Warehouse Union, who represent the workers at the West Coast ports, sat down with the terminals on the West Coast ports to hammer out a new labor contract.
Mm-hmm.
The existing labor contract is set to expire June 30th of this year. The challenge, though, is over the last 20 years, if you look at the history between these negotiations, there has not been one labor negotiation that hasn't resulted in a lockout, a strike, or some other slowdown. Now, it's really easy to explain that if there's any of those types of situations happen, it's going to create chaos in supply chains.
Yeah, that sounds like further supply chain bottlenecks and problems. And before I forget, if you have questions, you can enter them into the chat and we'll get to your questions as they come in. So what's the timetable of that? That sounds like a big risk for further bottlenecks.
So what both sides have communicated to us is that no one should expect that a new labor contract will be in place by July 1st. But that isn't necessarily cause for panic. Historically, there have been periods where there hasn't technically been a contract in place where the work has continued. Both sides at this point in time have communicated that they expect that the work will continue with or without a new labor contract in place by July 1st. However, and this is the but part, is the history hasn't always borne out that there's not going to be some sort of funny business going to happen.
And how long does that funny business last? I mean, you're talking about a workshop stoppage for how long, typically or historically?
Historically, So the last most significant labor stoppage was back in 2002 when the Taft-Hartley Act was imposed by then President Bush. I believe that shutdown lasted for approximately 9 days, if memory serves correct. That's 9 days. Maybe doesn't sound like a lot, but that played out over a series of months with supply chains as a result. But I think the important thing to kind of focus on in these negotiations is this all comes down to how productive the ports can be. If you look at how the U.S. ports rank worldwide, so the World Bank went back and they did a survey of 351 ports in the world, 351 most important ports in the world. The ports of LA and Long Beach are arguably the two most important ports in the United States. It's because approximately 40% of all containers that come to the United States come into those two ports. But if you look at how those two ports rank in terms of productivity in the world, how quickly they're able to move containers off the ship and get them underway, the port of LA ranks 328th in the world, and the port of Long Beach ranks 333rd.
That's not a report card you want to bring home to your mom, right? That's
No. There are some real productivity issues. Modernization of infrastructure clearly is part of the near-term and medium and long-term development of the U.S. economy. But we want to be realistic about this. We haven't had a real labor stoppage in over 20 years, and it's in no one's interest for that to occur this summer as China opens up and that wave of goods begins to arrive on American shores. I'm confident that that's just not going to happen. The U.S. economy clearly is growing actually fairly strong. I think, if you look at real final private domestic demand, it was 3.7% in the first quarter of the year. Top line RSM, Middle Market Business Index, actually indicated an expansion or an acceleration in the second quarter of this year. So I think that things are moving in the right direction, but that's within the context of we have to put inflation back in the box. And that's the real policy challenge, I think.
It seems like we're in a perilous moment, though, because more and more people are talking about the possibility of recession. There was a report today that half the CEOs surveyed think that there's the strong possibility of a recession. And Joe, isn't it true that in the past, when the Fed is raising rates, that unemployment has slowed typically? It's hard to avoid higher unemployment as you're raising rates, and that could lead to a contraction in growth. I mean, talk about kind of the historical background.
Right now, I think that there's a 35% probability of a recession over the next 12 months. My sense is it's not a 2022 story. If it happens, it'll be in the back half of next year in 2023, because it takes about 9 to 12 months for those rate hikes to really begin to slow things down. Now, each individual historical episode, you have to identify the conditions around which it occurred, right? Right now, we're short labor. Immigration's been falling for 20 years, and it's largely been cut off for the last 5 years.
That's the thing that seems unique about this period and different, that the risk of unemployment going up doesn't seem like it would be as high because there's such a labor shortage. It's a unique period of time after the pandemic where a lot of people started their own businesses, retired, didn't go back to work. And even before that, the pandemic, there was a labor shortage.
Right. I mean, so the confluence of events, right? A year into inflation following a historical pandemic, we're still seeing labor force participation rise almost 1% over the past 12 months. Now, I expect the unemployment rate to actually fall closer to 3% and plateau there by the end of the year. And I don't expect that to really be a material increase, again, until second half of 2023, just because of those factors that you identified. Casualties took during the pandemic, lack of immigration, and the fact that the labor force participation rate, which increased 1% per annum from 1946 to around 2010, has slowed to a crawl. 0.1% is my estimate on what's happening right now. Those demographics are not aligned with a traditional increase in unemployment as the Fed hikes rates. And I think it's one of the reasons why the Fed's retained some confidence that they can bring the economy in for a soft landing. It's going to be tough. I mean, what I'm telling the journalists that I talk to is the Fed's attempting to thread the needle. they're attempting to do it while they're wearing boxing gloves and wearing a mouth guard. It's right. The degrees of freedom for the Fed are very constrained here, but we'll give them a shot, see what they do, and we'll see how things evolve. I mean, look, inflation's above 8%. I don't know about you guys, but I see retail sales up by 1%. Even the control group, the one that we use to estimate GDP, the 3-month average annualized pace is 10.4%. Consumers are adjusting, but it's not getting in the way of their behavior, right? You can have a sour attitude on the economy and still spend in a robust way that ensures we will see growth, even adjusted after inflation. That's essentially, to me, the story of 2022.
And it also seems that the story is that it's the Fed's raising rates, but also some other big structural problems have to be solved, or at least some progress made. The Biden infrastructure legislation, how is that having an impact? Are you seeing an impact now, the money getting out there?
We're slowly starting to see an impact on it. I think it's, I think kind of taking Joe's point, like this isn't something where we're going to see huge changes right away. It's going to take time for this money to work its way through the system. The majority of the money that's available through the law itself has made it way the system. And even when it does do that, it'll take time.
So the way the policy was designed, we were only going to see an introduction of $16 billion in new infrastructure spending this year. Anything above that is just the administration pushing things out quicker. This was really designed to increase efficiency and productivity in the economy over the medium to long term. Unlike most bills in Washington that are designed to maximize near-term output in order to sort of increase the chances of election and re-election of the majority party, this one was not. This was done what I consider to be a bipartisan, forward-looking way that's in the interest of the U.S. economy and not in the interest of a single political party. So that's why we haven't seen that sort of burst. Now that will happen over the next 2 to 3 years. You'll see that occur, and that will really help as the economy slows. And it's one of the reasons why I don't think we're going to have a recession until maybe the second half of next year. And even then, I think it'll be somewhat shallow if we do have one.
Okay, so if there's a recession, it will be the second half of 2023 and shallow, in your opinion. Okay, so and this infrastructure bill, that the spending allocations was really not till 2023. You're going to see that. So we're talking about fixing roads, bridges. How, in your opinion, is that going to help supply chain problems, or how much is it going to help?
It's going to do a number of things. One, a lot of the underlying infrastructure that's critical for our supply chains, right? The ports, the roads, the bridges, right? They've been in a series of under-maintained, I think is probably a diplomatic way to describe it.
To say decay.
The U.S. as a whole has not been investing in infrastructure like other countries have. I think it's important to make the connection that our transportation infrastructure is just as important to our national competitiveness as other policies that are pushed by this government. So, having that infrastructure law in place, I think over time will be incredibly helpful if the money is allocated in the right way. But I think it's also important to look at some of the other things that aren't just purely money, right? So the permitting process for new projects. It can take anywhere from 10 to 15 years to get a new road or a new bridge approved after you go through all the various permitting and NEPA reviews and so on. In this current environment, right, if you're a state DOT head and you're making decisions about how you're going to be spending your limited transportation dollars, you want to make sure that there's a path to yes for any major transportation project before you sign off on that. And if you're looking at a potential of going 10 to 15 years of various reviews and then maybe getting a no at the end of that, it's going to be hard for you to justify to your constituents that it's right to build that new bridge or what have you. So for us, I think out of the gate, some of the more important policies that are coming out of this infrastructure law, are streamlining that approval process for those new roads, those new bridges, those new port projects. If we can get that right, that's really important, I think.
So if you can streamline it, you can make those approvals faster in theory.
And also give state decision makers more certainty about what the decision is going to be at the end.
And
of the
it's
process.
not just roads, bridges, ports, and waterways. And obviously the emphasis on ports is going to be with us for a number of years. It's broadband. It's rural broadband. It's connecting areas of the economy that are not really included in sort of that, what I call the new economy: technology, media, telecommunications, life sciences. Take a city like Oklahoma City. You go 20 miles in a 360-degree circumference, you're going back in time. And I don't mean the people's attitudes. I don't mean what they do or where they work. There's no broadband. Connectivity is not a fact of life in many of these places. So that there, I mean, that's where you really get the conditions to create some real momentum, not only in terms of increasing productivity, which lifts living standards of everybody, but creating greater and more inclusive growth. And I think that's really a critical component here, Darby, as we come out of the pandemic, because who suffered the worst in the pandemic? People in small rural communities who largely are employed by small business. Small business took it on the chin and just hasn't recovered yet.
And inflation, I mean, it hits everybody, but particularly people who are of lower income, it hurts more because it's taking a bigger chunk out of already limited means. We have a question from our audience, and it is, how does the port problem impact other forms of transportation like trucking?
So it's a huge impact, right? I mean, so let's talk about the Port of LA, Port of Long Beach, right? So there is a whole set of infrastructure set up to serve the port, right? You've got specific railroads that serve the port exclusively. You have short line railroads that serve the port exclusively, and those short lines will then move traffic for the Class 1 railroads. You also have a whole business model of truckers. They're called drayage operators who essentially focus their time on going to the ports, going to the containers, moving the containers that are at the ports, and then taking them to the warehouse where they are then distributed and set up. You know, one of the biggest complaints that we heard from our membership was the frustrated shipments that would happen at the ports themselves. There is a huge shortage. There is a lack of available inventory on containers and chassis at the ports, and the chassis are essentially the bed that you put the container on with the wheels that then, you know, last year and continuing now, a lot of those containers and chassis were essentially just sitting at the ports themselves. They couldn't be moved. And you would have drayage drivers who would come to the port. They would have an empty container that they would want to drop off and exchange it for a full container that they could then take to a warehouse. But oftentimes those shipments would be frustrated because that container that was coming in was a container that belonged or wasn't managed by that specific terminal, or the chassis may not have been in the state of repair that the terminal felt comfortable accepting. And so what happened as a result was that truck driver was turned away. And so you had that container that was still stacked up sitting at that port with the thousands of other containers that had been sitting at that port for weeks, if not longer, that weren't moving because the truck driver couldn't take that container and move it to where it needed to go. That continues to be a challenge I think needs to be addressed. I think it's not quite as bad as it was last year, but that's an example of an operational improvement that could be realized by the ports themselves to help improve the flow of the containers that are coming into the ports and get them off the property to where they ultimately need to go.
I recently watched a Wall Street Journal documentary about the supply chain. Have you seen that?
Yeah.
It follows a USB charger from its manufacturing in China and all the way through to its ultimate delivery on the East Coast. But they talked about the shortage of truck drivers in the United States. And the chamber, I think, lists the figure of 80,000 positions need to be filled.
Yeah.
That documentary pointed out it's not even just the filling the truck driver position, it's retaining truck drivers because they only get paid while the wheels are rolling and they're making the deliveries. So that scenario where you just described, where they go to pick up the container but then are turned away, that has to be another frustration of the job that leads to retention problems, right? I mean, if that's happening to you over and over again. Yeah,
absolutely. So the 80,000 figure is a number by the American Trucking Associations, and the truck driving shortage has been a problem for quite some time. It was exacerbated by the pandemic, and you're absolutely right. When a driver is getting turned away at a port, that's an opportunity. That's basically a situation where that truck driver is getting paid less than what he or she may have been paid if they were able to get that container moving on. Some drivers are paid by the mile. Some truck drivers are paid by the containers that they're turning.
Mhm.
So it all varies. But either way, that driver's not getting paid. You put on top of that the fact that you look at the long haul drivers, the ones who are taking that container from Los Angeles to Arizona or Texas, what have you.
Mhm.
These were difficult jobs to do even in the best of times.
Mhm.
And they were always difficult jobs to fill because they demand a very specific type of a person to do that work. But unfortunately, that shortage has only gotten worse since the pandemic. And it's going to be a real challenge, I think, for quite some time to get that under control.
Where do you see that going? Because so to get more drivers, to stay in the jobs, we mentioned more legal immigration. Perhaps that could be part of the solution. Um, what about autonomous trucking, autonomous vehicles? Is that something that you see in the future?
It's in the future. I don't think it's an immediate solution. I don't think it's a solution that we're going to see in the next 5, even 10 years. I think the real value for autonomous trucking, I think first and foremost, autonomous vehicles, I think, are best tested and realized in the commercial space because owners of those fleets can understand the ROI on those sorts of investments more so than the myself and Joe with autonomous vehicles and whether it be our Tesla or what have you. But I think there are opportunities with right now the infrastructure law included a pilot to evaluate the safety of allowing drivers of 18 to 21 to operate in interstate commerce.
Mm-hmm.
Today, you can't be younger than 21 to get a commercial driver's license.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's an important pilot. I think it's premature to say that. I think it's going to be difficult for any policymaker to sign off on lowering the age of truck drivers.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll see where that pilot comes out.
We'll have to pay a lot more insurance on those drivers.
We're going to have to pay more in
Yeah.
general. Look,
Yeah.
there's going to have to be a liberalization or relaxation of regulation around this because the demographic and population dynamics are not going to ride to the rescue here. If we're not going to look at an immigration as a potential solution, higher wages, younger workers, more hours, and then the experimenting with some of the autonomous technology that's out there. And it's going to have to be an indigenous solution to this.
The challenge, though, with attracting younger workers to a job like
Mhm.
truck driving, though, is that this is a generation that grew up looking at screens all the time.
Right.
And the pandemic, many people transitioned to virtual work. So they saw their parents, working from the home office, looking at a screen. So if you could make money working at home, looking at a screen, it's a little bit more challenging, I think, for employers to talk people into jobs where you're out doing physical labor, driving a truck, or whether it's you're a flight attendant or, all those kind of jobs that were glamorous in the past
I think
might not look as glamorous to young people today.
sometimes those of us in the professional class tend to look at the world through our own lenses, and it makes sense. We're all going to refract reality through our own experiences. One of the interesting things about living in Austin, Texas during the pandemic and in the years before was I got to go out and see how people live outside the major metros. Life's different out there. There are people who will do this work who aren't sitting in front of screens all day. I mean, remember, even at our best, only 40% of us are going to go to college and get a degree. Right? There's 60% of the people out there who will matriculate into these jobs if given the opportunity, if there's a proper push. And I think helping them find dignity in that work is something that we can do here, that the chamber certainly stands behind. Until we learn to talk civilly one another again about immigration, we're just going to have to muddle our way through this. And
it's also important to remember, Sujo's absolutely right. I mean, there are good paying trucking jobs out there today, where you don't need a college degree to do it. And you can afford to have your family enjoy a good life, especially in many parts of the country as well. And I think, quite frankly, we're going through a process now, I think, where we're reimagining what that job means for a lot of people. I know that a number of companies, a number of our members, coming through the pandemic, they adjusted their networks and they adjusted their service schedules in part to sort of accommodate some of these drivers who were coming on who weren't comfortable doing those. We'll be away from home for a week and then we'll come back the next week. That's one example of, I think, many changes that are coming for this industry.
More flexibility.
And I think also, there's a number of things that are out there that I think we haven't fully sort of integrated in the job itself, like how, this idea of the truck driver is also a drone operator, right? So so maybe that delivery person is going to a rural part of Kansas, for example, and they've got a number of deliveries that are a few miles away. You don't necessarily need to drive the truck all the way there. Maybe it's a small package and you can use a drone to finish that last mile delivery.
Where are we on the drone deliveries? We heard a lot about that, a few years ago, but I haven't heard so much about it lately. Is that something that's being, is there an uptake there?
I see the robots delivering around Austin now.
You do?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I've seen them around West Los Angeles. Yeah, this is actually happening,
Yeah.
but it's being rolled out in a rational, methodical way.
Yeah.
And I think, sure, why not?
Yeah.
Yeah, I see them going up and down the sidewalks all the time in Austin.
But that's more of the short haul delivery, like from
Well, it's part of the last
shorter,
mile, right?
delivery,
Yeah.
right?
But the last mile is where the real costs are. So
Yep.
you're unlocking value, increasing efficiency, causing costs to fall. That helps everybody.
Before deregulation, when the Teamsters were quite powerful, truck driving jobs were seen as one of the best jobs in the United States.
Yeah.
So was deregulation a mistake?
No.
Why?
Well, I think it unlocked a lot of value. I think, so you look at, the transportation costs have come way down because of deregulation. And it's not just the trucking industry, right? The railroad industry was also deregulated. The airline industry was also deregulated. With each one of those examples, costs came down for the average consumer across the board. It also opened up new opportunities for competition, right? So a lot of these routes in the 70s and 60s and before that, you essentially went out and you bid for specific routes to serve, right? And you essentially controlled that route, and competition was locked out. With deregulation, there's now other carriers that can serve that route, and they can bid a lower price than what you might have been getting before. Maybe not so good for that incumbent carrier who was serving that route, but certainly good for for everyone else.
Okay. We have a stagflation question from our audience. I believe recession is likely next year, but stagflation is already happening and will be there for a while. What do you expect the Fed will do in a stagflation environment next year?
Okay, so I would disagree that stagflation is here. Stagflation is defined as slow growth, high unemployment, and high inflation. We have growth, which is still fairly solid, high inflation, but unemployment remains low. So the menu options for the Fed are still basically hike the federal funds rate to a point where the rate's restrictive. It's going to slow growth. And then continue to draw down the balance sheet. So my estimation is that over the next 2.5 years, the balance sheet will be reduced by about $3 trillion. It's already caused the market to increase long-term rates by 50 basis points. And if necessary, the Fed can take the $2.7 trillion in mortgage-backed securities that it owns and begin to sell that into the market in order to cool housing. And housing's key, and I hope we get a chance to talk about housing and inflation and the economy going forward. But my sense here is that if you don't believe the Fed, if you're going to try to fight the Fed, you're going to come out on the bad side of that. No one can fight the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve intends to obtain price stability, and it follows through on the rate hikes this year. It's going to. And that's why I started out the broadcast with price stability is a precondition of maximum sustainable employment. We go from 0 to 300 or 0% to 3% in just a very short period of time. The economy will slow. The question is, will they bring it in for a soft landing, or will we have a short and shallow recession?
Okay, let's get to housing. That's something we've talked about before, Joe. 4 million short
Yep.
in the housing sector, and this is contributing to inflation.
Right. So the cost of shelter, the cost of housing is rising anywhere between 5 and 6%.
How's your house going, by the way? Didn't you just
We're
build a
almost, yeah,
house?
we're building a house in Austin and we're just about done. We're hoping to move into it in the next 30 days.
Okay.
We didn't run into the supply chain constraints that everybody did. We're closer to the Mexican supply chain, so glass wasn't a problem, windows weren't a problem. A little bit of an issue around cabinets that took a good 12 to 16 weeks. You know what the real problem was? There wasn't enough workers.
Yeah.
That was the real problem. That's why it came in an extra 2 months late, an extra 100 basis points on the mortgage that I'm going to carry, but still historically low. So I'm not going to sit here and cry, over that. But yeah, we were able to get it done. And this is key here because most of the inflation that we've seen had to do with the supply shocks during the pandemics. Some of those goods prices, the chip shortages is now beginning to solve itself. There's more auto production, which has caused the price of new and used cars, one of the main sources, to really collapse, and it's falling sharply, right? But inflation is spread out into the service sector, although the service sector inflation is only around 5%. It's not the 8% or the 20% you see in some parts of the good production sectors, right? But the owner's equivalent rent, the policy-sensitive portions of this do suggest that we're going to have to put in place policy to build more homes. There was a great piece by the head of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the gentleman who runs the National Economic Council over at the White House this week in the Wall Street Journal. 3 good first steps to begin thinking about how do we build more homes. There's well over 100 million people in train into the economy, Gen Z and the millennials, right? They're going to need starter homes. They're going to need affordability. There's a lot more that I think we could do on the policy side to stimulate this. Now the question is, and this is where it's going to get rough, is builders who become accustomed to 20% margins on these homes. Well, my sense is given the dynamic challenges that we're seeing around supply chains, the global economy, those margins are going to be compressed. So how many homes can we build at a reasonable pace? Right now, for the past several years, completions, not the starts and permits data, but actual completions, been between 1.2 and 1.3 million a year. That's why we're 4 to 5 million homes short in the economy. And this is something that I think should receive bipartisan support because after all, who's against A, more housing, and who's against B, owning more homes? Now, at the end of the day, this will come down to where we live, local zoning and ordinance laws. So when I said, who's against this? Well, there is a crowd out there, the not in my backyard crowd, the NIMBY crowd. And we're just going to have to overcome that or go around it or go right through it.
I see that in my town. I live in a town outside of New York City, and it's mostly houses. And then there are proposals to build apartment buildings on the downtown street. And people get very upset. They're worried the building will be too high. It'll block out the light, all sorts of concerns. And it drags the process out for a long time. So that NIMBY thing.
What I would say to those individuals is you have to look at the dynamic demographics at play. Those young people are the majority. It's best to accommodate them now than to wait for a point where there's so many of them that they start imposing their will on everybody else. No, I mean, we have to, like I was mentioned earlier, we have to learn to talk to one another in this country in a civil way, in measured tones, so that we have equity and inclusion. People feel that they have a stake in the economy, the direction of the economy, and the country, right? And it seems to me housing is the logical site to begin to have that discussion again in those civil tones.
But again, then we go back to the labor shortage. Who are going to be the people that build all these houses? And that continues to be a challenge. That would be a challenge for the housing sector as well, right?
Yeah.
What will the Fed raising rates do to the housing sector?
It's going to cool it off.
It's going to cool it off.
It's going to cool it off, right? I mean,
including construction.
The 30-year mortgage rate's gone from 2.5 to 5.5 in a short period of time. You need to have 20% down. There's no more no income, no jobs, no asset loans. The ninja loans are dead. Those died during the great financial crisis. The banks were a little too tight in lending for a long period of time. It's worked to create the shortage of housing that we have. But look, those interest rates are still historically low, right? If you are just entering the workforce, you're young, you can go to Fannie and Freddie and get a loan. You can get 3 or 5% down, if it's in the right district, at the right pricing, at the right price. And I think that, we can do these things. We know how to do them. Look, we just went through this, just incredibly difficult period of time around the pandemic. And if you look at the steps put in place during the crisis, we can do very difficult things. We can walk and chew gum at the same time. I remember when we used to send men to the moon and I had astronauts coming in my grade school. There's a time when we did good and great things, and we can do that again. We just have to choose to do it.
As far as supply chain problems, if you could have one good and great thing done, if you could have a wish granted, John, what would you say that would be?
Oh gosh, figuring there's so
No
many.
working shortages at
I
the
think
port this summer?
Well, I think just resolving the labor shortages across the board,
Mhm.
I think would be the best thing that we could do right now.
Mhm.
And I'd like to see the ports run 24/7.
Yeah.
We
Well,
need to have them open.
We need to have them open, but we also need to figure out how not just to have the ports run 24/7, but every other segment of that supply chain extending from the
Yeah,
ports, right?
that's
the
right.
warehouses.
24/7.
That's
Yeah.
exactly
Because if
right.
the ports are 24/7, but there's no trucker to pick up at 2:30
You
a.m.
know,
that's an
most
issue.
Americans take a look at our friends over in the UK and Europe is they take 6-week vacations. They don't work a lot. Those ports are open 24/7.
Yeah.
Mhm.
They've negotiated with labor in a very difficult way to make sure that these things run on time and they're always open. And they don't really face these problems that we do.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's plenty of opportunity, lots of value to unlock, again, by engaging in civil conversation.
Let's talk about China and the impact of supply chain with the zero COVID policy. So there were lockdowns. They have this zero COVID policy. It looks like some of the lockdowns are lifting now. But what are some of the risk scenarios you see with that, John?
Well, that zero COVID policy is still in place. So that's uncertainty for however long.
Zero COVID is still there. Some of the lockdowns, I think, in Shanghai were recently.
Yes.
They said they were going to lift them.
They're starting to lift them, I believe, but and that's going to look, all that pent up demand, right, for the goods means that you're going to have a surge of traffic coming to our West Coast ports in coming weeks
From China.
But that zero COVID policy remains in place, and what I mean by that is, Joe, I think said this at the top. He's absolutely right. For whatever reason, China has chosen to use its own vaccines. They're
Mhm.
not nearly as effective as the vaccines that are on the market here in the United States.
Mhm.
And so that means that the Chinese population is more susceptible to a future outbreak of COVID. And
Mhm.
while that policy remains in place, then it's very likely that you're going to have a shutdown take place in another one of these cities in the coming months or
Mhm.
weeks. And when that happens, that's going to only be, it's not going to just impact what's happening in China,
Mhm.
right? Because you have the factory that shut down, and that means less production and less goods coming here to the United States.
Mhm.
But it also introduces more uncertainty for American businesses here, right? So there are examples of businesses hoarding goods because they don't know when they're going to get the next shipment.
Mhm.
Well, that one business that might be hoarding those goods means that there's less of that various widget available for other businesses,
Mhm.
whether it's a competitor or whether it's another industry that relies on that good for whatever that they're making.
Mhm.
So it's an example of policy that just reverberates throughout the economy in ways that may not be fully accounted for at the time that policy is stood up originally.
In the middle market business index survey, where supply chain is mentioned as a major concern, how much is China specifically mentioned as a concern?
No, China's the primary
thing.
concern because they just produce so much.
Mhm.
I think the thing to remember here is if you're running a commercial enterprise, simply because you and the American public have moved on from the pandemic doesn't mean the world has.
Yep. Yep.
We had very good policies put in place the last 2 years. The MNRA technology is just really something of a miracle.
For the vaccines.
It worked.
Yeah.
Right? We had some good health policies around most of the country. We can move on from this now in many ways, even if there's going to be, a few bumps in the road here this year and probably next, but the world itself is not there. And we shouldn't expect that.
Speaking of the world and global concerns, with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that has also presented new issues with the increasing the prices of energy. What risks do you see for the supply chain related to that geopolitical event and that it's ongoing?
Yeah. Well, I think first of all, just recognize how awful the situation is. Looking at the supply chain example, I mean, so Ukraine is responsible for approximately 70% of all calories consumed in the world.
70%.
17%.
17.
Sorry,
I was gonna say 70.
articulate a little better. Yeah.
17% of all calories consumed in the world because they're a major producer of wheat.
Yes. But also take into account that has impact. So a lot of the markets that Ukraine's wheat market serves are in North Africa, the Middle East, and around and within Eastern Europe and Russia.
Mm-hmm.
So that's having an impact today that I think Americans just frankly aren't aware of,
Mm-hmm.
right? But also take into account that a lot of wheat is grown with fertilizer, right? That's a petrol product in many respects. The wheat that is produced, both in the Ukraine, the United States, oftentimes is dried before it's shipped to wherever it's ultimately going.
Mm-hmm.
That drying process is done with propane, oftentimes. So all the inputs that are involved with producing wheat and all the other various agricultural products that the U.S. and other countries are responsible, all those inputs are going up in cost.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, Ukraine, awful. It's having an impact in ways that I think we're not necessarily feeling, but all the inputs that are involved in our own production processes
Mm-hmm.
are, we're going to see that. Consumers are going to see that.
So the Russia-Ukraine war is increasing inflation, contributing to inflation in food products and also in energy.
That's right.
Yeah.
And that's a big concern. And what's next on the agenda is whether the EU is going to bar Russian energy imports. Is that something that
Right. So
is a big concern?
if you're running
for
a
you?
business here in the United States, I think it's reasonable to assume that the EU is going to decouple from Russian energy markets, which means the Europeans are going to look to other places for energy. That will cause the price of oil and natural gas to increase all around the world, right? So if I've got Brent crude, which is the global benchmark, moving somewhere around 115 to 117, West Texas Intermediate, the US benchmark is somewhere between 112 and 114. It's reasonable that those prices are going to go up, which will feed through and cause gasoline prices to go up. And then the unfortunate problem is we're going to have a global food crisis probably this summer, right? For Americans, this is going to cause some disorientation. You may see top line inflation come down even if gasoline prices continue to rise, which will cause real tension out there in the commercial community. One way to cool the global economy off is to send oil prices back above 130 or to 150. Right? At that point, we really won't be talking so much about inflation very quick. We'll be talking about demand destruction as something very different, right? But that's how destructive Mr. Putin's price shock to the global economy potentially is.
And kudos, Joe. You really predicted exactly correctly. Before the Ukraine invasion, I asked you what you predicted. You predicted $110 per barrel for oil, and that's where it is. How concerned are you that this conflict is going to go on for, months, if not years?
Well, I mean, it looks to me like neither side's exhausted, which means it's going to continue to go on. Now, I'm not a geopolitical expert or an international security expert, but I do know the longer this goes on, the more it will cause the global economy to slow, for demand destruction to set in. And then that's where it gets very difficult, right? Because you have a competition for resources. One of the more discouraging things that I saw this week, especially around the food equation, India said they weren't going to export any more food.
Oh, wow.
Right? You mean we're almost setting up for something really bad this summer and this fall. The last time we saw this was the late aughts when the price of wheat, the price of pita increased to such an extent that it caused some governments to actually collapse, largely where you'd think sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East.
Okay, well, in the remaining minutes that we have, let's focus on some of the good news.
Yes.
Some of the good news about this economy is the spike in small business creation.
That's right. So during the pandemic, we saw a level of business formation that we quite frankly hadn't seen since the Reagan era. I think that the dislocation caused by the pandemic, just the pervasive shock, led some people to say, you know what, I'm going to exit what I've been doing, and I'm going to do something different that's more fulfilling. It's in the area of my expertise, and I think I can make a go of it. And that's continued even as we've emerged from the pandemic. And remember, that may not add much to the economy today, but in the medium and long term, those are the companies that are going to drive innovation, create competition, new products, new services, and develop economies of scale, right? I mean, think about it. In the early aughts, I spent a lot of time in Palo Alto. And I used to like to go to lunch at this bar and grill, and I talked to these guys from Google. And I would sit there and I think, you guys aren't doing this. No. Well, maybe I should have bought that house in Palo Alto for $400,000 at the time, because boy, did they ever, right?
Yeah.
And that's how this works. That's the dynamics of the American experiment and modern capitalism. Yeah. And the way capitalism is working now is we're moving into a digital phase that's just going to change everything. And it's that digital velocity that you want to attach yourself to, because I think that economy is going that way.
And what do you think, John? What is the good news as far as your field of transportation, supply chain? What are some of the glimmers of hope or good things that are happening?
Well, look, going back to the infrastructure law, I mean, that was a historic piece of legislation. It's one, unfortunately, but good news, it was passed on a bipartisan basis. Congress and policymakers still recognize the importance of transportation and the investments to support it, right? Going back to supply chain crisis we had, America was very resilient in the face of a lot of challenges, when it came to what was happening in our ports. But I don't think that there's ever been a point in time where Americans have been more educated about how they get their stuff than what happened last year. And this,
Yeah.
look, so my grandfather was a farmer, and when I was a kid, he'd always tell me, John, like, Americans don't understand where their food comes from anymore, right? And that's true. It's also true for basically every other thing that Americans consume today. And the fact that we came through this year where Americans were able to see up close and personal what a challenging supply chain means for them and their ability to get a couch on time, right? Or food, like, I think that's a powerful story. It was a challenging story, but I think at the end, it's a good news story.
Supply chain has become a big thing on TikToks and memes. So, and it's like a big conversation piece and joke. So you go to the family function, your aunt says, "Why aren't you engaged yet?" And just supply chain problems, So it's really become part of everybody's everyday language, supply chain. Just blame it on supply chain problems. So it's making all the economics professors very happy. I'm sure that people are actually talking about it.
Brand new programs of specialty on this. This is great stuff. Yeah.
Well, on that note, supply chain, I'll close it here. Thank you very much, John Drake, Joe Brusuelas. We appreciate your time. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining our webcast. And stay tuned for the Middle Market Business Index results. They are going to be posted June 6th, I believe. Is that correct? And you can get the full report on RSM's website. I'm Darby Dunn. We're live in Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for joining us.